Welcome to When Women Preach. This podcast exists to empower AAPI and Latina women faith leaders. It was created and is hosted by Isaac, the innovative space for Asian American Christianity. My name is Cris Otonari. We're also here with our co-founder and CEO of Isaac and the founder of this podcast, Young Lee Hertig. Our guest for this episode is Jennifer Guerra Aldana, and we're excited to have her back. She recently completed her PhD. Congratulations and welcome to the episode, Jennifer.
Thank you so
Well,
much. It's so fun to be back.
I want to say, Dr. Jennifer Guerra Aldana, wow. It seems like yesterday that we all gathered at St. Paul's Commons in Echo Park, and I took so many notes from this bilateral gender summit on the Louisville Institute grant. And you all shouted out, there has to be a space where we highlight women of color's voice. And, we need the central portal to do that. Here we are, 2025. We've been doing this since 2019. From that context, our rock star, Jen, came back as a doctor, and I'm delighted to honor all of your hard work and what you have been enduring and accomplishing. So congratulations, Jen. So how does it feel?
Thank you. Gracias. I've been getting this question, which is an appropriate question recently. And what I have said to folks is it's a mixture of some grief, some relief, and a lot of joy. So the process of research, I took on a research question that I think some might scoff at what they call me search, right? Where you put yourself and the fullness of who you are into your research question. I
Yes.
refused to bifurcate myself in academia, so I brought my full self. And what I studied had a lot to do with Latinas, theological education, leadership. And so there was a lot of good grief work done in the research process itself. But I've also carried this identity of professional student, for the past. Like when people have asked me in the last decades of my life, since age 5, right? Like, what do you do? And part of my response has been, I am a student. So there is a bit of grief work, both on what was learned in the research of the conditions for Latinas in theological education, but also a grieving of an identity I've carried for quite a bit of time. An identity that brought me a lot of joy, that brought me a lot of colleagues, folks, friendships that have, followed me into this season of life in ministry. There's also just a relief, like I did it, I finished it, it was accomplished. I sought out to finish the dissertation within a year. And
Wow.
at the 10-month mark, it was completed, and I started the preparation for defense. And so, it just feels like an incredible relief to, it's the largest project I've ever worked on, in terms of academic work. And so I'm relieved that I passed, that it's done, that it's on ProQuest, that I've been hooded. All those things feel like the relief. And I also think there's a communal relief. I've been so well loved, so well resourced and supported. There's many stories of horrific PhD journeys, and that is not mine. I was well loved and fed and encouraged and accompanied. And so I know this is not just my relief. The people who have walked with me the closest, I think, are also relieved that we are done.
Well,
we can change the convo topic for a little bit,
all right. Please share with us your dissertation title.
Yeah. So it's named Abriendo Brecha, Lived Experiences of Latinas in Leadership and Theological Education.
Wow.
How timely, even all the more timely. And maybe let me break through your grief phase.
Hmm.
by emphasizing while it's still fresh in your mind and
Yeah.
heart and in
Yeah.
your body,
Hmm.
please publish. And you get knock on the door of the Louisville Institute and get the, the first publication grant.
Yeah.
And go for it, Jen. This voice is much needed. Whoa.
Thank you. Yeah. And, along with the grief also came deep joy. I think this is something I've
Mm,
known about both ministering and being a part of the Latina immigrant community at large. For every room that was not created with us in mind, we always build tables of belonging wherever we go. And so
mm,
for the grief of the systemic oppression that we all face, there was also an inherent joy that came from knowing that that does not get the last word. It does not get to
mm.
define us as strong as others assume it does. And there is a deep joy in this work. I've always known I was a curious person, but this is an academic way of being curious, research. And so I also just enjoyed it. It wasn't torturous. I didn't lose my faith in life, in
Yeah.
theological education, in my faith. If anything, I found a more profound and maybe more mature joy than when I entered it.
That is so rare a comment that you hear somebody who just walked graduation and reached this milestone.
Mhm,
So I also remember you, and I'm locating you to a local church in
mhm,
East Pasadena.
mhm.
Are you still doing ministry on top of teaching?
Yeah, I transitioned from being on a pastoral team at La Fuente Ministries, which is a congregation I so love, was part of the planting pastoral team for it, and in a lot of ways continue to be part of the imagination building for this
Mhm,
PhD work. One of the things I learned in grad school is I worked full time. I went to school full time and then was part of this planting team of the church. And after 4 years of doing that and sustaining that, granted, I was in my 20s, so I do think that there was a different level of energy, but I ended up in the hospital twice
Oh
for
no.
different conditions, different things. And so I did not envision myself as a professor or getting a PhD for that sort. I think even one of our early conversations, Young, was you telling me or encouraging PhD work and me just thoroughly denying and not really wanting to entertain such endeavors. Um, and that is the whole story of how I ended up saying yes to this. But when the choice came to say yes to this unique season of ministry, uh, I had to take stock to not repeat the narratives of generations past that saw suffering and sacrifice as the only way by which we serve. And I chose to engage in some really healthier boundaries and rhythms for my life. And so I stepped away from pastoral weekly preaching ministry. But the work of the professorate that I do now is where all of that ministry energy goes to. I still accompany folks on their quest for God, for quest for connection with God, self, and others.
mhm,
So much of my lecture space is the deep excavation that you work through discipleship. And I may not be preaching on a weekly basis, but I now get to accompany the emerging female voices that are preaching in congregations as youth pastors, as lead pastors, as executive pastors in different congregations. And so I see my ministry as simply have expanded and having a new location, but not necessarily ending, but simply
No.
relocating in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Um, Expanded definition of ministry. Teaching in Christian university, we also accompany students. I remember feeding students and having them over and,
Hmm.
more holistic way. So,
Yeah.
having done academic teaching and creating my own teaching space under Isaac, what are some of the most compelling stories generated out of your classroom in terms of intergenerational aspect that you can share with us?
Yeah. I mean, one of the stories that come to mind is I was teaching a class on the the gathering. So what most folks would associate with a Sunday morning, and it had a particular focus on the sacraments. And so my idea was, yes, you could write a term paper. You could write a 5 to 7 page paper on your theology of worship and the gathering and sacramental, positions based on your denominational training. Who wants to write that? I don't want to read that. That sounds incredibly boring to me. Plus, with the rise of AI, I mean, it could be something that's so easily reproducible. And so, really taking into consideration what are the ways in which we assess learning, the highest form that proves somebody has internalized information is, can they now make, can they innovate, can they apply what they have learned? So, I also was like, okay, y'all, here's the reality. If you were to step into a local church, you don't choose who your ministry team members are. So what I did is not randomly, I took a look at the diversity in the classroom and I paired people with the most diverse option for them in the classroom. And they became co-pastors for the semester. And
Wow.
their final was to design a worship gathering and to integrate both their own background, their story, their experiences, with also the learning objectives of the class and course readings and research. And at the final, right, the final day, their examination was to present their worship design and to speak to how they integrated each other's idiosyncrasies with also the course content. And time again, these unlikely pairings of ministry created a really robust example. I gave them all the same lectionary text. And so that was also part of what made it dynamic is had all done the same exegetical biblical work around the text. But I tell you, every single partnership had a very different expression of that gathering, of that worship gathering. And what I embedded in the classroom was quite a bit of time of storytelling around stories of what worship songs remind you of home, what meals make you feel, like have folks actually replicate a process by which you would get to know an actual ministry partner. I was like, what would be the ideal process by which somebody would engage a new ministry team? And what are the things that people always skip? And we go to calendars and planning, and I'm like, people end up being an event planner at church and they forget the relational ties that are needed to actually do this work. And so I think those are one of the most salient stories is actually designing a pathway by which students got to know one another and then had the same amount of training and time to reflect on the biblical story, on the different ways of engaging the gathering. And what emerged was something quite stunning. And they all walked away. And one of the students reflected back to me and said, I just didn't know designing worship could be so fun and thoughtful at the same time. And I said, hang on to that, because in most congregations, it's not fun or thoughtful. It is people really get on each other's down throats. And it often is the place that most conflict arises in the worshiping community is the flow of Sunday. I think one of my favorite moments in that particular classroom is for folks to say, for me, the most important part is worship. And I said, okay, I want you to do some historical research as to why your theological conviction puts singing on top of, the word or the sacrament. And then they sort of went, oh, wow. The way that I've envisioned worship comes from a particular time in the Christian tradition, has been reinforced by the local church I go to. And so I've set a benchmark for what normal is. And yet that benchmark is not something that needs to be everybody else's benchmark. So we ended up with a partnership that did quite a bit of silence, did quite a bit of breath work. We had other partnerships who really emphasized service. And so the second half of the worship gathering was the congregation being invited to enact what they had just heard about. So you just end up with a multiplicitous amounts of examples of what are the different rhythms that shape a community. And students, by seeing everybody respond to the same Sunday, right, theoretical Sunday, and the same piece of scripture, I hope they walked away knowing that the diversity in the room matters only as you are able to actually see it as a gift to implement,
Right.
not just as like a representative picture of all the colors under the rainbow, but rather like, and how does that presence shape the imagination that you enact worship from? Uh, and that's only possible when you actually have diversity in the room, which we did.
Exactly. Wow.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I feel like signing up.
I know. I want to take one of your classes. Um, I
Anytime.
have I have a year left, so I'm thinking
Mhm.
about, post seminary, and
Yeah.
I'm curious, just
Mhm.
listening to you talk, um,
Mhm.
a couple things. One is I have an Asian American ministry concentration,
Mhm.
so a lot of my theology is contextualized for the
Mhm.
AAPI through an AAPI lens,
Yeah.
and yours is Latina. And so
Mhm.
I'm just curious if you have thoughts about how can we collaborate and center voices around each other's social location, and then how do we continue that once we're done with seminary?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a challenge to do the question you just posed for the reasons that I don't know that we know how to have friendship. Um,
Mm,
Oftentimes in Christian higher ed or the conference spaces, we have let business sector language kind of take over our imagination. So we talk about networks, we talk about collaborations. But I think in the Christian imagination, for me, my conviction is, do you know how to be a friend? And
mm,
from that deep space of friendship, have the most robust, beautiful ministry, alive partnerships come from. So sometimes we think that like team building activities, and I go, no, become friends. Like be a friend. And we don't have to engineer meals. We don't have to
mm,
engineer story. Like, and now you will share our story with like, and that's what I was trying to like kind of foster to say, hey, we have let all this business sector frameworks come and become the new standard for, we even call it partnerships, which is not necessarily something that I always see as the most effective way, right, to
Mm-hmm.
do work with those. And so I get a beautiful joy of collaborating with folks from all sorts of cultural backgrounds. But I think what has made any of those partnerships or collaborations or however you want to call them possible is I am actually their friend.
mm,
I know their life story. I know the dynamics with their parents. I know what kind of coffee they like to order. I can read their faces in the room and go, oh, wow, they're really upset. Or, oh, that really, they lit up doing that. And so whenever I hear language of like, how can we become better collaborators? I have actually returned to, do you know how to be a friend?
mm,
So I am so honored and gifted to be able to have collaborations with Asian American women, with African American women, with Indigenous women from across the board. But it didn't start with what will we do together? The question is really, how can we be friends with one another? And from that sense of actual kinship, then something can burst forward. We don't start with the doing first, we start with the being first.
mm,
And I think that's my biggest encouragement is that we focus on becoming friends with those that are across all sorts of different socioeconomic or socio cultural or socio everything, that we learn how to be a friend first and let from that place of friendship, let the rest flow. But when we
mm.
start with the end in mind, yeah, that's a business sector framework. I do not
That's
start with
great
the end in
insight.
mind. I never have. I've never perked
Mm-hmm.
someone and said, you know what we're going to do? No, it's hi, I'm Jennifer. You know, I
Mm,
think glitter is a color. I'm connected to the borderlands. I love meals. Like, I just be a friend
I
and
love that.
let the spirit of God inspire the work you will do together. But I don't think it should be the other way around. I've never had it be like that in my life.
Mm,
It's always emerged from friendships.
love
So,
that.
Jennifer, you just shared a loaded concept of friendship. Power asymmetry
Mm-hmm.
somehow is in the way.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm,
I'm currently grappling with.
Mhm.
How do I forge friendship with Asian American woman faith leaders? I have yet to succeed in that.
Mm.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. And I don't think it's an oversimplistic response. I think that in any relationship we have in our lives, we have to recognize the dual role that we coexist with, right? And
Mhm.
so in this ministry partnership that you talked about, there were dual roles. I think that what made the friendships and ministry partnerships possible is that you had a team that was committed to reflection and to repair. We often talk about conflict resolution, and I'm like, again, not against that, but I don't know that it's always about managing conflict. I think it's about
Mhm.
knowing what is the process by which we repair trust broken or failed promises or miscommunication. So I do agree with you that it's not something that everyone, and I wouldn't say it's not that everyone knows how to do it, is that we don't see these models as often. And so they're
Mhm.
harder to imagine
Mhm.
because when we were forging this distributed leadership model, it didn't come without conflict. It didn't come without significant repair. It didn't come without significant reflection, but everyone had to have the same level of commitment to make it happen.
Right.
I rather opt to try to lead with friendship than to opt to lead because of a role, of a title, and positionality. How that plays out, yeah, there's more heartbreak than breakthrough in that commitment.
Mhm.
But the fruits of that are also what I most believe in and what I find deep delight in as well.
Jen, you are such a dynamic speaker. I think
Yes.
Chris also had another idea. You were going to ask her another question,
No,
Chris?
I'm just agreeing with you. I did have one
Yeah.
question that's
Yeah.
just fun. I was just curious, since you have a plethora of free time now that you finished school, uh, if you are planning to do something fun for yourself.
Yeah. I am planning to reconnect with the friendships that really matter a lot to me.
Mm.
I think that this program required a lot of, I was in an orientation meeting, and one of the women who was speaking of her own PhD journey, she said something to the akin of like, forget having social events in your life, forget having impromptu dinner dates, forget. And I just listened to her and I was like, no,
Do
I will
this?
not do that. No, I still went to birthday parties. I still showed up to my friends' heartbreaks and wins. I still made time to make meals. It was at a different rate than I
Mhm.
did beforehand, but I refused. Again, academia thrives on creating individualism and
Yes.
making you feel that you are the superstar and are doing this all by
Mm.
yourself. It's a myth, and I don't believe it. So guess what? I still hung out with my friends and I still didn't do homework some nights and I went out. Whoa, big whoop.
Woohoo!
And yet, like, but it's the both and. Like, I refused to let an academic program keep me from community because
Mm.
that just felt backwards. And the tetherness I had to community was at a different level than I was used to. And so, yeah, my commitment in this next year is to reconnect to that depth that I know was there. Because just because these friendships made it through these 4 years of a PhD program, they've made it at a different decibel of depth than we're used to.
Mm.
You look healthier than ever. And
Yeah.
I think any listeners out there who want to contemplate
Hmm.
getting PhD, I
Hmm.
think you just gave them how to's, because academic life can be very isolating and
Yes.
lonely. You don't
Yeah.
have to. You don't
Nope.
have to do it that
Nope.
way.
I took active writing retreats with a cohort mate. We refused to write the dissertation in solitude. So we would take ourselves to cities and we would write during the day. And then at 6 p.m., laptop was off and we went and had so much fun.
It's
And guess
amazing.
what? The writing still got done, everybody. Like, you don't have to torture yourself to do good work. In fact, that's like the wrong way to do work. But let the fullness of your humanity produce good fruits. And I got it done in a year, and I still took trips, and I went on dates, and I engaged with friends. And the thing is that my writing, I think, was more effective because I came at it from a place of abundance, not from a place of
Mm,
duty and control and responsibility. I was like,
Mm-hmm.
it'll get done. And I think that's part of like my own Latina cultural wealth coming through of there's just this inherent trust that if I attune to the practices that we are committed to, both in the spiritual realm of the Christian tradition, but also in the things we know how to take care of in the cultural sense, the work always gets done. I'm uninterested in assimilating to any other program or institution because it's never loved me back, but my community always has. I think whatever institution we associate ourselves with is it's simply a place of resource, but it's not a place of identity.
mm,
Um, and
Amen.
I think
Amen.
there's an importance in keeping those two things apart.
Well, wherever
yeah.
Jen goes, there's a community and fun and laughter. I
Yes.
think that's why you look healthier than ever. Thank you, Dr. Jen, for coming on. And I look forward to visiting you at your campus and have some fun.
It was great having you. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
so
Take
good to
care.
engage in conversation together.